From Boyle Heights in Los Angeles, California, Libros Schmibros Lending Library presents the Latinidad Beyond Borders podcast. Latinidad encompasses the diverse experiences of people who live in Latin America, as well as people of Latin American descent who live in the United States. This podcast explores culture, society, and politics across the Americas through the lens of Latinidad. Welcome to another episode of Latinidad Beyond Borders. I'm your host, Alberto Sahagún. Today, our guest is Lina Britto. She's a journalist and historian. She's an associate professor of history at Northwestern University. In 2020, she published a book called Marijuana Boom: The Rise and Fall of Colombia's First Drug Paradise. She's also co-editor of an anthology on Colombian history, 2 volumes. The first volume is called Histories of Solitude, and the second volume is Histories of Perplexity, published in 2024. Welcome to the show, Lina.
Thank you so much for having me, and hello to our listeners and viewers.
Thank you. So, what's been on the news recently is the strikes against alleged drug boats by the Trump administration. So as of today, we're recording this on November 7, and there's been 17 strikes over 2 months, with approximately 70 deaths. And we have little information about this. So the way the Trump administration wants to portray this is that there are foreigners and illegal immigrants bringing drugs into the country, into the United States. But the reality is that U.S. citizens have played a major role in the drug trade from the very beginning up to the present. And that's something that you've done research on. And so talk about how the drug trade between South America and the U.S. has developed and evolved beginning in the 70s into the 80s and forward.
So one of the things that we notice right now that is very salient in what's happening is the use of the term trafficker to justify and legitimize what is in all way, shape, and form extrajudicial executions, right? Even the United Nations acknowledged recently this week that what's happening is out of the rule of law, that there's no proof, no evidence, nothing about the activities of these so-called traffickers or trafficking boats. And what we see is kind of like how now the Trump administration is recycling a very old strategy or tactic of the war on drugs, of the prohibitionist and punitive paradigm of drug control that the United States inaugurated in the late 60s with Nixon, but it has become the paradigm of drug control, not only in the Americas, but globally. And is the use of the term trafficker to legitimize this type of violence on the part of the state, and a violence that goes out of the mechanisms of the rule of law. So to your question about, okay, so these so-called traffickers that are probably people from the Caribbean, they say that they are Venezuelans and Colombians. So far, I haven't been able to corroborate that information in the region. We know only of one person of the victims that was from the region, from the city of Santa Marta in the Colombian Caribbean coast. But everybody else, it seems that they were either from the islands or maybe from Venezuela. But that's hard to tell precisely because they're not sharing information about the people killed. They're not sharing the evidence that they supposedly had against these boats and against these people. The point is that they were all from either the Caribbean or Latin America. as if traffickers, the term trafficker, is only assigned to people that come from what we now call the global south. And to the people that are here in the United States, taking care of the commerce, the exchange, the distribution, either at the wholesale level or the retail level, the term trafficker rarely applies, right? Because we have, all these decades of the war on drugs, learned and interiorized that type of language in our commonsensical way of talking about these issues. So traffickers are usually either Black or brown people, that many of them are foreigners, that they come from abroad. They actually depict it as a invasion, as a foreign invasion of United States and white America, right? And it's never considered how within the United States, white Americans have played a major role in the commerce and the trade of drugs, in the not only the distribution within the continental United States, but also the circulation of these commodities from their centers of production abroad to the markets of consumption domestically. And that's part of the history that I'm trying to untangle with my second monograph, like an individual book project that I'm working on. And is about how the countercultural generation of the 60s, especially during the 70s and part of the 80s, what we call usually hippies, right? But it's more than just the hippies, play a major role in modernizing the way in which drug commodities circulated from the centers of production to the markets of consumption, and how they themselves consider what they were doing a very important type of economic activity, a form of smuggling, but they didn't call themselves traffickers. And actually, when I talk to them in my interviews, they are always making a distinction between the trafficker, which is again that Black and brown, usually men, that comes from abroad, usually the Caribbean or Latin America, and is a type of invader, of the United States good customs and values, right? And they themselves make a distinction between them being, mostly consumers who happen to be in the smuggling business of the drug commodity that they themselves consume, and traffickers, those who are in the business of trading in drugs for just profits. They don't have any connection with the drug itself. They're not exploring altered state of minds with the drug. They don't really care about the drug, or that the culture of consumption that is created around the drug. So they are very much detached and in the business just for profits, not for exploring another lifestyle and another type of consciousness as they consider themselves to be. But the truth is that beyond that distinction, which I'm not denying that is an important distinction, they were very important pioneers and entrepreneurs of the drug business in the United States, because they were the ones who transformed what it was until the late 60s, a small smuggling business, right? Controlled by just a few networks of a few individuals, very sporadically, that even though was very profitable, that's why it existed, but it was not a big deal. And it's that generation what transformed that into a massive market of consumption with a massive networks for the circulation and for the production of these products.
Right. And in your book on marijuana, you talk about how Americans went to Colombia to uh, find a market where they can purchase these goods, get these goods to the U.S. It wasn't Colombians going to the U.S. It was Americans
Exactly.
going to Colombia.
And they not only went to Colombia, they went to many countries around the world. In my book, I found information of the National Archives, which are in College Park in Maryland, in which reports from Interpol, meaning police departments from different countries around the world, sending information to the Interpol, the international police that gather all these reports about young Americans. Many times they describe them as hippies going to different countries in the Middle East, different countries in Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, right? Many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean looking for marijuana, whether in the form of flower or in the form of hashish, which is the extract, the oil. And we have those reports from many countries around the world. It just happened that Colombia, because of many factors, including the proximity to the market of consumption and the fact that the war on drugs was not happening there yet, as it was happening in Mexico and as it was happening in Jamaica, other two countries in the hemispheres that were visited regularly by these hippies looking for marijuana. Colombia didn't have a war on drugs then at the time. So that's why it became, among other factors, one of the main providers of marijuana. And it became the main supplier for at least a decade, according to all official sources of information, including the DEA. So they were not just going to Colombia, they were really canvassing the world in order to find the marijuana that they consumed and that they started consuming in larger numbers.
Right, right. So we've seen this war on drugs in the United States has focused on mass incarceration, right? Uh, and in terms of Latin America, South America particularly, there's been a militarized approach with the US and Latin American governments over these many decades. So, what has been the cost of this war on drugs for countries like Colombia and in that region?
Oh, it has been immense and it hasn't really been measured because what is measured is how many hectares we are eradicating, how many tons we have seized, how many traffickers have been put in jail. But the human cost uh, and the environmental cost of the war on drugs hasn't been measured yet. And I really like how you put it that the war on drugs really has two phases. The domestic phase here within the United States that manifests mostly as mass incarceration against, again, Black and Brown populations, and the international phase, which is happening in both producing countries and transshipment countries, countries that are very important in the circulation of these commodities from the centers of production to the markets of consumption. And that's where the war on drugs has focused on. And there, the main target has been mostly the poor people, peasant communities of all kinds of racial and ethnic backgrounds. Some of them indigenous, some of them of African descent, some of them just mestizos, mixed race people, but like poor peasants that are the ones that are involved in the production of these commodities because there's not many other options for them, and they have been the target. So that's why a lot of people, not just myself, but like we scholars who study the war on drugs, we call not the war on drugs, but the war on poor people. And I will say that is even more than that. The war on poor people, whether it's domestically or internationally, is just the symptom of something deeper, which is the war on drugs as a packet of strategies and tactics for the administration of a state violence during key moments of systemic crisis like we are seeing right now. So that's why it's not a surprise to scholars and people who study the war on drugs see what's going on right now in the middle of a systemic crisis, right? That is economic, that is environmental, that is political, that is cultural, that is happening at all different levels. The war on drugs is resuscitated, right? Is brought back to life to work as a packet of resources for the administration of state violence and the legitimization of state violence.
Yes, and how has that played out in the history of Colombia in the recent decades?
I think in Colombia, at least we have at least three different cycles or moments or historical periods in which we see the war on drugs in different manifesting in different ways or being adapted and adopted by the governments of Colombia in different ways. Because it's very important to say that is the war on drugs is not just an imposition of Washington. It is in that way in certain moments, but it's also a voluntary adaptation on the part of the national governments precisely because it offers a packet of strategies for the administration and the legitimization of state violence. So the Colombian governments have willingly, most of them, some less than others, adopted and adapted the war on drugs for their own purposes. And I think that has happened in three different moments. The initial moment, which was against marijuana, the conversation that we just had, that happened starting in the late 60s, and during the 70s, it became one of the main export sectors in Colombia. And by the late 1970s, the Colombian government and the American government, and it was Jimmy Carter, it was not Ronald Reagan. And that is important because it shows how the war on drugs is not just from conservative forces within the United States. It's really a bipartisan consensus, and it has been used and applied by both Democrats and Republicans alike. So that was the first moment against the marijuana in the late 70s, early 80s. Then we have kind of like a little period of like a little pause, and then we see it resuscitate or reactivate again in the mid to late 80s against the cocaine cartels, right? So that's the most famous history because, the mass media have made a lot of money fictionalizing that story, right? Netflix, Narcos is the case most well known, but it's not the only one. A lot of movies, TV shows, telenovelas, etc., about this second moment. But that's kind of like the second historical period of the war on drugs in Colombia, right? So that is the very violent one, the car bombs, the selective assassinations, the war against state and society, really. And then we have a third moment at the end of the millennium in the late 90s and early 2000s, which happened under the umbrella of Plan Colombia. So Plan Colombia was an aid packet that Washington, the Congress in Washington, approved for Colombia that fused anti-narcotics and counterinsurgency and targeted the southern region of the country on the Amazonian region where most of the coca crops for the processing of cocaine were taking place at the moment. And Plan Colombia, it targeted that region that it happened to be also FARC territory. So the FARC was the largest guerrilla organization in Colombia, which demobilized less than a decade ago. But Plan Colombia was targeting their territory and their activities because a lot of the money that they were using for the war was money that was coming from the cocaine economy. So that is kind of like the third moment. Right? And then we enter into a pause because the government at the time was in peace negotiations and conversations with the FARC, and the United States was supporting that peace process. But that peace process came to an end with an accord in 2016. And since then, the struggle has been how are we going to implement this? Because one government, the first government after the signing of the accord, didn't want to implement anything. Then it came another government, which is the one that exists today under Gustavo Petro, the first leftist government in Colombia ever. And it has been very inconsistent in the implementation. So it's in this context that we see the war on drugs coming back, this time not in the hands of the Colombian government, but in the hands of the United States government. And it seems to me that this is inaugurating a fourth cycle or a fourth stage in this long-term history that I just lay out.
Yes. And the current president, Gustavo Petro, who was elected in 2022, he's been very public about his criticisms of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has responded, and the Treasury Department imposed sanctions on Petro and his family. So they're trading insults and things like that. So how do you interpret what's going on between these two presidents, and is it having any actual impact in terms of U.S. support for in this military strategy against the drug cartels and things like that?
Well, it's a very, very complex situation. So I think whatever I said is going to be short to the complexity of the issue. But let's discuss some of those layers. So on the one hand, there's a project on the part of the Trump administration of regime change in Latin America. So a lot of what's going on right now, again, the war on drugs has never really had anything to do with drugs. That's what I tell my students. If that was the case, then it would be a total failure. But because that hasn't been the case, it actually been a total success because it's about state violence. So they are using the war on drugs in this context to force a regime change in Venezuela, to kind of like prepare the ground. That's Marco Rubio's agenda. That's his goal. And he is the force behind the whole thing. I don't think Trump himself cares that much. I think it's mostly Marco Rubio and the people behind him, the ones who really care about this regime change. So that's one thing. The other thing is that both presidents, Trump in the US and Petro in Colombia, are very different ideologically, politically, their trajectories, their goals, etc. But there's something that they are very similar. And they are similar in the performative character of their politics, how they present themselves in the public sphere, especially of the social media. And they both are very keen of using the social media without filters, without advisors, without PR people, just they themselves at night in their office or bathroom or who knows, just tweeting things, right? And that's one of in that dynamic, in that style, performative style, a dynamic of escalation has created. So they are now engaged in this riffraff, right? Between I said something and then you're going to answer with the most outrageous things that you can think of. So it's a very dangerous game because it's not about them and their outsized personalities, it's about the country. And at this point, it's about the hemisphere. Given the moment that we live in right now, the last thing that we need in the Americas is an invasion, an occupation, a military war in the continent. And I think they are kind of like risking that possibility precisely because of the agendas that they have behind, right? Of the regime change on the part of the US and in the part of Colombia. What's going on is that we are preparing for another presidential elections, a presidential elections that will be tremendously consequential because it will be the possibility for the leftist coalition to remain in power or for the return of the right? In a context in which, the United States will be happily supporting the return of the right in Colombia, right? So in that context of electoral politics and turmoil, we see the reaction of the Petro administration and Petro himself to what's going on, because it's a power struggle, really, of two different point of views and even world views.
One final question. Given the history that you've studied of the drug trade between the US and South America, will these attacks on alleged gunboats have any significant impact on the flow of drugs, do you think?
Not at all, zero. First of all, we don't even know if those boats are really moving, transporting drugs. As far as we know, and the little information that we have, some of them were actually fishermen. So even if they were transporting drugs, even if that was true, and every single boat was a boat full of cocaine, right? Let's say that it has no impact whatsoever because the large amounts of cocaine that come to this country from Latin America are coming through other means. On the one hand, are coming mostly from the Pacific, and we have seen a couple of these attacks in the Pacific in the last few days, not only in the Caribbean. It's mostly coming from the Pacific. It comes through other means, through a lot of corruption, through ports, through airplanes. So it doesn't really make a dent in the amount of drugs that's coming to the country. On the other hand, one of the major problems of drug use and abuse and addiction in the United States is about fentanyl. And the fentanyl is not being produced in Colombia or Venezuela. So that's another issue why this is completely irrelevant. So this is really a spectacle, a media spectacle, right? Which is pretty much what we have seen also with the immigration enforcement activities. Like the creation of these images using high technology in the case of the attacks in the Caribbean and the Pacific, images produced by the drones that attack and kill these people. In the case of ICE, we see all different kinds of images from their own cameras, that they bring with them when they go into these operations, and the cameras of the people that witness and is trying to resist as well. So the trading in images is as important or more important, I will say, that the trading in drugs at this point. And the economy that is really being profitable politically right now is the economy that is trading in images and projecting the idea that this government, is strong, that it has the capacity, that is not weak, that is willing to do whatever to protect the morals and the values of white America. And that's pretty much what is being traded in and what they're profiting on.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. That was very informative.
Thank you.